President Donald Trump, we say that you will succeed and America will yet again prosper. May you manifest in the brightest of colors and may your reign be righteous. In Jesus' mighty name.
So President Trump, we set the name of the Lord upon you, and we declare that no weapon formed against you will prosper, that every tongue that rises up against you in judgment will be condemned. And if God be for you, who can be against you? We bless you, President Trump, in Jesus' name.
Welcome to the Ken Harbaugh Show. I've got Kristin Du Mez back today. She is the award-winning author of the runaway bestseller, Jesus and John Wayne, and I think it's fair to say now a filmmaker as well. We collaborated on For Our Daughters, which was a joint production with Meidas Studios. And Kristin, you have been sounding this alarm for years now.
Yeah.
That film, I think, was the last appeal to reason that this was going to happen.
Yeah.
Christo-fascism, Christian nationalism, wasn't just it wasn't alarmism. We see it before our eyes with a prayer at the inauguration, appealing to heaven to smite anyone who dare raise a voice against Donald Trump. How do you react?
Yeah, like you said, there's no surprises here. If you were paying attention, if you were listening to Trump's Christian supporters, if you have been for the last decade now, right, this is familiar material. The conflation of God's will with Donald Trump's agenda, with Donald Trump himself, this is just par for the course. And the idea that you can call on God and align yourself with this sense of God's will and spiritual power and use that to justify, essentially whatever you feel like justifying, this is where we're at right now.
As a professor at a Christian college, I'd love for you to help us disentangle this whole idea of the national project as a godly project and the teachings of Jesus about his ministry not being of this world. I'm working on an essay now as a reaction to a bumper sticker on a big pickup truck I saw, which was a cross draped in the American flag, which is something that probably wouldn't have jumped out at me 10 years ago, but is, based on what I know now, just so antithetical to everything the actual Jesus taught about faith and rendering unto Caesar and this idea that the government project is somehow a divine project.
Yeah, I was just reflecting on this contrast to earlier today between the prayer that you're referencing, or the kind of conflation of the Lord's Prayer, Donald Trump, calling on God to essentially, smite all of Trump's enemies, which is a whole lot of Americans, the way they understand the world, including the two of us, right? The contrast of that Christianity and that Christian prayer, if you can call it that, and I think we have to, frankly, they're doing it in the name of Christ, with the sermon offered at the National Cathedral by Bishop Buddy. And if you listen to that sermon, the final plea to Donald Trump is getting a lot of attention, but I would point your viewers to the sermon itself, where she presents a different kind of faith and politics combination. She reminds everybody, herself included, that the line between good and evil runs through every human heart. It does not run between one nation and another nation, between one political party and another. And she reminds her congregation and the country of the need for respecting the dignity of all humans, whether we agree or disagree, for humility, right? And for Jesus' command that we love our neighbor and love our enemies. So a completely different approach to taking the Christian faith and the words of Christ and applying them to our political context.
I want to play a clip of that sermon at the National Cathedral, and then I want to talk a little bit more about it.
Let me make one final plea, Mr. President. Millions have put their trust in you. And as you told the nation yesterday, you have felt the providential hand of a loving God. In the name of our God, I ask you to have mercy upon the people in our country who are scared now. There are gay, lesbian, and transgender children in Democratic, Republican, and independent families, some who fear for their lives. And the people who pick our crops and clean our office buildings, who labor in poultry farms and meatpacking plants, who wash the dishes after we eat in restaurants and work the night shifts in hospitals, they may not be citizens or have the proper documentation, but the vast majority of immigrants are not criminals. They pay taxes and are good neighbors. They are faithful members of our churches and mosques, synagogues, wadara, and temples. I ask you to have mercy, Mr. President, on those in our communities whose children fear that their parents will be taken away, and that you help those who are fleeing war zones and persecution in their own lands to find compassion and welcome here. Our God teaches us that we are to be merciful to the stranger, for we were all once strangers in this land. May God grant us the strength and courage to honor the dignity of every human being, to speak the truth to one another in love, and walk humbly with each other and our God for the good of all people in this nation and the world. Amen.
Kristin, can you talk to us about the reaction this sermon received? And I wanted to play it because unless you actually heard it, you would think that she had brought out a whip and flail and driven money changers from the temple, right? That wasn't the tone at all. It was so measured and compassionate, but the reaction has been insane. You had a Republican representative actually saying this bishop should be added to the deportation list,
Yes.
Mike Collins.
Yes. It's been called shameful. She's been called all kinds of names, apostate priestess, and, absolutely dragged by a whole lot of Christians in power and a whole lot of Republicans as well. And on the other hand, many, many Christians who have heard her words are sensing, yes, this is the faith that I believe in. Or even people who are not Christians who hear that and say, this is beautiful, right? Even though I'm not a Christian, I do not confess this faith. It resonates with me deeply and powerfully. But I want to point out that the attacks that conservative Christians have made and these MAGA Christians have made on the bishop are strategic. This is a deliberate strategy, and you've seen this play out over and over again over the past few years. And in fact, you can see it played out through almost a century of American history. A deliberate strategy to quite literally demonize progressive iterations of Christianity, the social justice, the social gospel tradition. Right, this has been a deliberate strategy and well-funded by corporate interests, I might add. And it is also at the heart of Christian nationalism, because Christian nationalism depends on this us versus them mentality. If you are not with us, you are against us, and you are against God because we're on God's side. And other Christians, other Bible-believing Christians pastors, preachers, right? Who challenge this, who say, no, actually, I'm a Bible believing Christian, but this is not how I interpret the words of Scripture. They have to be destroyed because they get in the way of this key us versus them strategy. And that's what you see play out over and over again. And so the conservative crowd that has long championed religious liberty, right? It's not looking so good right now in terms of how they're responding to Bishop Buddy.
I want to pick up on your choice of words in describing the strategy coming from the right towards the compassionate interpretation of Christianity, the real interpretation of Christianity. You said their goal is to demonize them.
Yes.
And I think that that's what they're doing in a literal sense. I've read piece after piece and honestly tweet after tweet calling these references to the compassionate Jesus as demonic, or someone like the bishop as an agent of the devil, satanic. They are literally trying to cast this in Manichaean terms, with the agents of good under Trump and the agents of the devil being those who oppose him.
Exactly. No, this is exactly the strategy. And I think for people outside of these traditions, and even for some other Christians who don't come from this kind of charismatic brand of Christianity, that they might not take that kind of language as seriously as it's actually intended. That people inside this tradition, and these are millions of Americans and some of Trump's most stalwart supporters in charismatic revivalist movements, right? Many of whom were also behind the January 6th attack. They take this spiritual language extremely seriously. And so it's very powerful when leaders use this language. What they're doing is they're kind of, calling on their millions of followers to see individuals and entire faith communities as enemies of God and enemies that must be destroyed. The language is very militaristic, and it's chilling, to be honest.
Hey everyone, it's Ken. As much as I love and appreciate all of you and how much you care about politics and the future of this country, I understand that sometimes you just need a break. We all do. Well, I could not be more excited to partner with Forward Retreats to tell you about an upcoming writing retreat for anyone who wants to dive deep into the stories that make us who we are. And trust me, you will come back enriched and fulfilled and ready. So join two fantastic award-winning writing coaches, Anne-Marie Kelly and Phyllis Biffle-Elmore, in France this fall. We all have stories in our pockets about love and loss, heartache and grief. Let Phyllis and Anne-Marie help you put your stories on the page. Come together with a community of other writers and aspiring writers to search for answers and dismantle the roadblocks that stand in your way. What is the heart of your story? Why are you the only one who can tell it? You'll begin each morning writing in the seaside village of Arcachon, southwest of Bordeaux. Every afternoon, you'll be free to create, relax, and explore, and commune with fellow travelers. At the heart of this retreat is the practice of writing as a form of healing. This once-in-a-lifetime retreat is for women of all ages and experiences who long to write achingly beautiful prose in a transcendently beautiful place. You can find out more at forwardretreats.com, and be sure to include the code 25AK for $900 off this amazing writing retreat. That's code 25AK for $900 off. If you've ever longed to put your story on paper and just needed the right excuse and the right coaches, join this amazing team in Seaside, France this summer. Click the link in the show notes to learn more. Thanks.
It feels like the ratchet can't go any higher. I mean, I've been waiting and waiting for the moment when the rhetoric has reached a point where it's literally crescendoed. And I don't know how you can get any worse than calling someone an agent of the devil. I mean, the worst thing you could say, 10 years ago was that they were a communist before. I mean, take your pick, but we're at the point now where we're calling the enemies of Trump agents of the devil. Where does it go from here?
I don't even want to know. I think it will go beyond rhetoric. Scholars of authoritarianism and scholars of genocide are very clear to point out that language of dehumanization precedes violence. It always does. And so as somebody with that historical background, that's something that I keep in mind. But I want to raise one other point as well, that for many years, observers of kind of the radicalization of the Christian right had often pointed to the fact that that conservative Christians felt embattled, right? Demographic changes, and then with Obama in the White House and the Obergefell decision, and they just felt so embattled and were trying to protect their religious liberties. And that's how you can explain their sometimes overly combative posture. But I think it's very important to point out that these conservative Christians have arguably never had as much power as they do in this moment. And what we are not seeing is a softening of that rhetoric. We're seeing the exact opposite. We're seeing more of this demonization, more of these pylons, more of these attacks, and the language is vicious. And I think that is something worth noting, and it should be a cause for concern. And maybe we need to look back over previous years and recalibrate just a little bit our understanding of what was actually going on. Was this genuine fear, or was this a deliberate strategy to stoke fear in order to consolidate their power?
I'm sure you have a theory about the answer to that. One of my co-producers on another film project, an evangelical Christian, has said very compellingly to me, with references to history and everything, that Christianity has always been at its best when it hasn't been in power,
Yes.
when it has indeed been a persecuted religion. In fact, it has a persecution complex because of that, because of how it originated. And I think American evangelicals wear that cloak because they feel they have to. There's an attraction to this persecution complex, even if it isn't really happening. I mean, having been to Ukraine multiple times and seen what persecution of Christians really looks like, to come home and hear people complain about a war on Christmas makes me bristle.
Well, exactly. And, for people of faith, there shouldn't really be, persecution is no threat to true Christianity, right? I mean, that's the kind of the logic of it. One of my former pastors, who comes from the Black prophetic tradition, like to say, Jesus Christ does not need your protection. God does not need your protection, right? Just chill, right? Faithfulness, yes. Obedience, yes. But, you don't have to fight to protect God. And that's, that kind of language, you have to fight to protect God, to protect truth, to protect, all that is good. That really generates this kind of aggression because the stakes are always ultimate, right? The stakes are always ultimate. And that really is a convenient strategy to radicalize entire populations.
What are you hearing from your students? Because there's a generational divide here as well. Are you getting any special insights, positive or negative, from around campus?
Yeah, so I haven't, we've been on break and I'm not actually teaching this semester. So I've just met with one student. But generally I would say what I've been picking up is, I think that, there has been a kind of, lack of attention among many students, which is probably shocking to somebody like you and to me, right? In the past, we've often seen younger people really kind of lead the charge. And in my spaces, and I know it's different on some university campuses, I've seen a whole lot of avoidance. People sticking with their own, homework and their own classes and their own career goals and not really recognizing the gravity of this situation. And I think part of the explanation there is, first of all, it's so contentious now to talk about politics, particularly in Christian spaces, that a lot of people decide just to keep their mouths shut. And so these loud voices are the ones that continue to dominate. But I think that there's also a sense of just not realizing how bad things could get. They have only known the Trump era in their kind of semi-adult lives. And so I don't think many of the students right now recognize what a historical pivot this moment actually is, and that there is really no precedent for what has happened, and the future is incredibly uncertain. They just don't grasp it.
Right. And it makes no sense to my kids to say this is not normal, because it is normal. For their entire lives, this has been the norm. So we need another way to communicate that this is not okay.
Exactly. This is the norm, and it's been going on for a long time. And this is also the way things go, right? For those of us who have studied authoritarian movements, so much of what has happened in the last decade is straight out of the authoritarian playbook, like in nearly every aspect of it. But historically speaking, it often takes around a decade for the power to be consolidated. And so in previous years, 4 years ago, even with the Biden win, I kept that in the back of my mind, right? We're not out of the woods. This is not usually how things go. You chip away and you slowly kind of degrade the norms that have held up a democratic society, the guardrails, and we've seen those just stripped away.
Obliterated the norms, the traditions, and now the actual legal infrastructure to restrain the chief executive is being dismantled. I'm going to put a link to this article below, but there was a fantastic piece about the first 53 days of Hitler's chancellorship and how it took 53 days to go from a democracy that elected Adolf Hitler to what we understand as the Third Reich. I'm going to send you out with a trailer, with the trailer for Our Daughters. It's heartbreaking, the work you put into that and the result the American people delivered. But can you talk just briefly about some of the response you got from women across the country in church communities and non-faith communities about the message of that film?
Yeah, we made the film For Our Daughters because we wanted to show the rest of the country what they might expect if Christian nationalists took hold. And we can tell you from women themselves who have lived inside these right-wing Christian communities that it is horrific. Abuse of power, sexual abuse, covering up that abuse, so many horrifying stories. And these women, all of whom grew up in conservative Christian spaces, right, who are faithful, obedient Christian girls and Christian women, right, suffered this abuse. And they, at great risk to themselves, decided to bring their voices to this film and sound the alarm. The response among Christian women has been overwhelmingly positive. And in some ways, that's even all the more tragic because we are now in the era that we warned about, where the rights of women are extremely vulnerable and where brute power is what is respected. And so, we're going to continue to fight and try to push back and try to protect the vulnerable. But it's a daunting moment.
It is. Well, thank you, Kristin, for everything. Thanks for your time today, but really thanks for your commitment to this cause and for things like Jesus and John Wayne and for Our Daughters and everything else you're doing.
Thank you, Ken. Also deeply appreciative of the work that you're doing.
I regretfully had a sexual incident with a female high school senior in the church.
He tells the world that it had occurred. And everybody stands and they give him a standing ovation.
A jury in New York has found that Trump sexually abused and defamed E. Jean Carroll and awarded her $5 million in damages.
It may seem surprising that a self-professed moral majority would end up supporting a candidate who has bragged about assaulting women. But if you look inside their own communities, you can see how for decades they have propped up men who have abused power and have excused all kinds of harm, all kinds of abuses for the sake of that power. The ends justifies the means.
I will fight even harder for Christians with 4 more years in the White House. I get in there, you're going to be using that power at a level that you've never used it before.
We wake up tomorrow in a Christian nation. Will women have the right to vote tomorrow if you wave that magic Christian wand?
No.
Macho power is not what Jesus calls for. Jesus himself did not operate in that way. Jesus was gentle. He was humble, particularly in his relationship with women. In that way, he told us men what we are to be like.
And I think what we have to grapple with again is that the reality that those of us who are raising our voices are not calling for a departure from Christ, but rather a return to who Christ really is.
Love this video? Make sure you stay up to date on the latest breaking news and all things Meidas by signing up to the MeidasTouch newsletter at MeidasTouch.com/newsletter.